Hey guys, welcome to tutorial 21 in our Pandas course. Here we're going to study data frame comparisons and iterations, and we'll learn a few techniques to compare rows, columns, and various elements in data frames, as well as iterate through them row by row, column by column, or over the entire data frame. So we're going to start by comparing entire data frames, then we can compare individual data frame elements, and then compare data frame rows or columns. After this, we'll learn a few techniques that will help us to iterate through data frames, again, either by row, by column, or by both. So let's head on over to the code and get started. Right, so we finished off in section 20 last time by talking about various data frame operations. So hopefully you're fairly comfortable with that. And we can move on to the comparison portion. So once again, let's start up a new cell, and we're going to actually just copy over a couple of data frames. So I'm just going to use the same data frame from before. And you know what, we can make this a bit smaller. I'm actually going to change this just back to column 1 and column 2. Okay, and we'll still have 4 rows, that's fine, but I'm actually going to have only 2 columns instead of 3. This will just make it a little bit easier. I don't think we need the extra column there. So I'm going to call this df1, and this will be df2. So we'll keep the same labels, but we're going to just change up the values a bit. For example, 2, 5, 1, and I'll do like 5, 8, and then I'll leave that one as 6. Okay, good stuff. So you have a couple data frames to work with. I'll just print them out as reference. So I'll print df1 and df2, and then as per usual, I'll just print out that dotted line. And this will kind of serve as our cutoff. Okay, so this is what we're dealing with. These 2 data frames, again, only 2 columns this time, same column labels. The row labels are the same, but the values are slightly different. Okay. Now, the simplest form of comparison is just by using our basic comparison operators. So these are going to be our greater than or equal to, less than or equal to, is equal to, and not equal to. You should be fairly familiar with those if you know Python. So we can just take one data frame and compare it to another. Keep in mind this will actually return a new data frame that will contain a bunch of true or false values, much like with series. So we can create a data frame called greater than. I'll just call this GT for short. This is going to be df_1 greater than df_2, and let's just go ahead and print out greater than to see what the results should be. So again, we should get a data frame with a bunch of true or false values. Now the way in which this works is it compares element to element, so specific row and column to specific row and column. So in this case, 1 is not greater than 2, so it's false. 1 again is not greater than 5. 3, however, is greater than 1, so it returns true. And we can't really compare the not and numbers. They're not, greater than each other. And they could be equal, but we're not going to compare one to another. Okay. Otherwise, again, we're going to get false because 4 is not greater than 5, not a number, not greater than not a number. 9, however, is greater than 8, and then we get the 6s, which are equal. Okay, so you can see, again, exact same structure of a data frame. It just compares each individual element to the respective index in the other data frame. Now, we can use these operators, again, less than or equals to, greater than or equal to, etc. Or we can use the functions, GT for greater than, less than, or LT, less than or equal to, greater than or equal to, is equal to, so just EQ, and is not equal to NE. These are all exactly the same functions as we saw with series. We can apply this to entire data frames. So again, to do the same operation using those functions, you do df1.gt, or greater than, and then we can pass in the other data frame. Alternatively, we can actually pass in specific columns if we want, or we can pass in rows to specify that we're comparing across columns or across rows. Okay, we're not going to be doing that specifically. We actually just want the general comparison. So I'm just going to pass in df2 here. The results should be exactly the same because we're still using the same operation, still going to be a greater than operation. Okay, so again, for reference, there are the greater than or equal to, greater than, less than or equal to, less than, is equal to, and not equal to. Okay, now once more, this is different from the equals operator. So if we do a data frame df_1.equals, okay, this operation is actually just going to return true or false if all of the elements are equal. It will return true if all of the elements are equal, false otherwise. For example, this will definitely return false because we have a lot of different elements between the two. I'll just put this under greater than for now, but it doesn't really make much sense. But this is false, clearly, because our two data frames are not equal. They don't contain all the same elements. So I'll actually just put this in equals. Okay, cool. So what about comparing entire rows or columns? Well, that's super simple. Remember, each column or each row is really just a series, so we can use the exact same logic on those. We've already actually covered comparison across series, so it's really no different there. Let's say we want to compare the first columns. Okay, so we can do greater than is equal to df_1, and we're just going to get the column we want, so in this case col1. Remember, this is just going to be a series, so we can again just use the exact same operation, col1, okay, and then we can go ahead and print that out. All right, again, we can do exactly the same thing with the .gt operator, okay, or rather gt function, and that is once more going to return us the exact same result. Just note again, this is a series that we're returning, not a data frame. And that's because we're only picking out a single column, which will be a series. Okay, so these column comparisons, as well as the row comparisons, will yield series, not data frames. Now, just to demonstrate across rows, although I'm sure you guys are smart enough that you don't really need it, we're just going to do a df_1 dot. We'll just do a lock, okay, and we'll do row1. Okay, and we're going to do a greater than df_1 dot lock, and then row1, and this should actually be 2. Okay, then we can go ahead and print those out. And again, same sort of thing. We're obviously getting the columns that we're comparing. We only have the 2 columns here, so we're just going to get a series with those values and then false across both, because that's not greater than and that is not greater than either. Okay, we can also use those same operators. So let's just copy, okay, and we're going to do dot greater than and put that in there, okay. So once again, we can run it, and there we go. Okay, so that's pretty much all I want to cover when it comes to the comparisons. Again, the comparisons are really quite straightforward. Once we're getting down to individual rows or columns, we're just dealing with series, and we've already covered that before. So now we'll talk about iteration. This one shouldn't take too long. Now, there's lots of ways in which we can iterate through a data frame. We can iterate through just the columns. We can iterate through just the indexes or just the row labels. We can also iterate through the items, which will help us to get the column name and the rows. Or we can iterate through the rows, which will help us to get the row name and then the column values. So I know that's a lot to take in. We'll walk through each one with you guys. Okay, so for starters, we'll just iterate through all of the columns. Okay, so we would say something like for col in df_1. Okay, we can just go ahead and print out the column there. I'm just going to get rid of this print statement. Okay, so this just actually prints us out the column names. So this doesn't print out the column values themselves. Don't worry, we will get to that. Okay, and if we want the index values, we actually need to specify that we want the indexes specifically. So we would say for row in df_1 dot index. Okay, we could print out the row. And I think I'm just going to comment that out so we don't get lots of stuff being printed. Again, this is just going to print us our row label. Similarly, we could have done df1.columns, okay, and then just prints out the columns. That's really just a list of the columns there. But by default, if we iterate through a data frame, it will just print us out the column names. Now, likely that's not really what we would want, because we can actually just access those again through columns and indexes. We'd probably want to print out the individual elements within a data frame. So one of the ways in which we can do that is just by looping through the columns and then guessing each of the rows in that column. So for this, we would do, so let's say for key value, because we would think, you know what, actually that's probably not the best nomenclature. We'll just say for row name, row_name, and row value in df_1 dot items. Okay. Now the items function will return us again each individual column, and then the value will be the rows. So we're actually just going to print out the row name, and then we'll also print out the value, okay, and then we're just going to print out a little bit of a dotted line here, just so we have some separation between them all. Okay, and oh, right, that should actually be row value. All right, we'll go ahead and rerun that. So this will just take a second, and there we go. Okay, so you can see that it basically loops through the columns. Okay, so it runs twice only, because we have only 2 columns here. So it's not running through each of the individual rows and then the columns, it's just running through the columns. So df_1.items will give you, in this case, 2 columns, because that's all we have in the data frame. So it will loop twice. Each time it's going to print out the name. And you know what, again, really not great nomenclature, should actually be the column name. So we'll do column name, okay, and then the row value, okay. So that should be a little, yeah, that should be a bit more straightforward. Okay, so we have the column name itself being printed out, because we're iterating through each of the columns, and then the value itself is the entire row, okay. So row value is actually a series. In fact, we can print out the type of row value if we want to see that. So type of row value, and we should get a series each time. Okay, and that's exactly what we get. So it's as if we're just separating things out by columns. So we get the values and the index labels, values, index labels, and so on and so forth. Okay. Now we can actually do the reverse. We can loop through each of the rows and then get the row name and then the value, which will be the entire column. Okay. So actually, you know what? I wanted that. I didn't want this type anymore. So I'm going to copy this and just comment it out, and then I'm going to paste it here. So now we're dealing with the rows, so we'll do the row name and then the column value, okay? And instead of df.items, we're going to do df.iterRows. It basically does the same thing, but kind of the reverse for items. So instead of iterating through the columns, it will iterate through the rows. Now, I'm going to return me my row name and the column value. So let's go ahead and print those out. So this will be the row name and then the column value. So this will be running 4 times now. Okay, the previous one ran only twice because we have only the 2 columns. This time we have the 4 rows, so we'll get this running 4 times. Okay, and that's what we get. So each time it's printing, or rather treating each of the rows as a series, with the index labels as being column 1 and column 2, and then the respective values. It's even given the names, okay, and up top is printing the names here. That's just because we're printing out each of the row names. All right, so I think that's actually pretty much all we wanted to cover in this tutorial. So we started off with the comparisons. We saw that we can compare entire data frames using our comparison operators, or the functions here. The equals, again, is only going to return true or false if the entire data frame's values is equal to the others. We can also pick out individual columns or rows and compare them just like we would with regular series, because of course an entire row or a column from a data frame is just a series. We can iterate through our rows and columns in various ways. If we just iterate through columns in the data frame, it will just give us the column names. If we iterate through the index labels, it will again give us the index labels. Alternatively, we could do the dataframe.columns, and that will do the same thing. If we want to, however, iterate through the actual items or the actual rows in our, I guess actually first we'll do columns. If we wanted to iterate through the columns in our data frame, in this case we had 2, we can get the column name and the row value in the dataframe.items. So with the items, the key will be the column name, and then the value will be the actual row itself. Or I guess this is more like a tuple. So it's like the first item is the name, and the second is the actual column's worth of values. So that's returning us an entire series with all of the column, all of the row names and the row values, like we saw with this. Okay, so if we're iterating through just the items, we get 2. I guess it running 2 times, and we get 2 series. We get the row 1, 2, 3, and 4 in column 1, and then the same in column 2. However, if we want to iterate through the rows, we use the iterRows function. And again, it returns us the same thing. So for each time, it gets the row name that we're on, and then the value is the entire column's worth of values. Or rather, it's the value across each of the columns. Okay, so we saw that this is actually running twice. Column 1 and then column 2, column 1, column 2, and for each time it will print out basically the respective rows worth of values. So in case it wasn't clear, I think I kind of jumbled up my words a bit there. The iterating through the items, will go through column by column. So it will return you as many series as there are columns in the data frame. Iter_rows will go through row by row, so it will return you as many rows as, or rather as many series as there are rows in the data frame. So this gives us 4, this gives us only 2. Okay, otherwise that is it for now. Definitely practice the stuff, make sure you've got it down. In the next section, that should actually be our final pandas section. We're going to be learning how to read a CSV. Don't worry, I have one already formatted and available to you. It's just a really simple one with a bunch of numbers, but we'll open it up, take a look at it, and then learn how to read it. Okay, so that's it. Thanks for watching, and see you guys in the next one.